Hi, Cynthia Allen, Feldenkrais Awareness Summit. We're heading into the middle of day 2, and we're getting ready actually for our final interview in the nervous system health track. But first, there's something I have forgotten to mention in the prior 2 interviews before. So I would like to tell you about the fact that you could have captions on during most of these talks. And this is how you would do this, or why you would do it. So why you would do it is that we have a number of people who are tuning in, quite a few people who are tuning in where English is not their first language. And so for those where English is not their first language, or where English is your first language, but the speakers may be speaking in English and it's not their first language. So there's an accent that you need to be able to navigate. And lastly, for people who are hard of hearing or hearing impaired, hard of hearing or deaf, they may want to have their captions on. I suspect they already do. Here's how you would do that. You could go do it right now, but you would need to leave the meeting and then pop back in real quick, or you can do it before the next session. And that is, you need to go over to YouTube and find a video that has captions, which is almost every major video out there. So not something obscure, they may not have their captions turned on. And make sure that your closed captions is turned on. It's at the bottom of your screen. Now, if you see captions running right now, it means your captions are on. You don't need to worry about it. But if you don't see captions running, that's how we get them, is through our YouTube service, and you would want to turn that on. Okay, so that's it for captions. And then also, you may be not aware yet that we have live chat between each other available. So look around your platform, your device, and find the live chat. Arlene Klein, our behind the scenes summit coordinator, guru, whatever we happen to ask her to do and make happen for us, is there, introducing herself. You can chat with each other. We will use your chat to grab out ideas or questions and fold it into the panel discussion that will be following this exact talk here. So we're getting ready for our first panel discussion after this. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce to you Eveline Wu. She is a Guild certified Feldenkrais practitioner. She's been working with clients with chronic pain and helping them find emotional ease for over 18 years. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California and works with clients who've had early childhood trauma. That's what she's here to talk to us about today, is how to recover from abuse and trauma using the Feldenkrais method. And she's in California, somewhere in the state of California. I'm not quite sure, but we'll find out where from her. So, Eveline, thank you. Good to have you.
Great. Am I on now?
You are.
Well, hi, Cynthia. Really great to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me, and this is totally new for me to do this online. So
it's outside your comfort zone, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And
a lot of other people.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a lot of newbies for even having a video camera. We've had some people that had to buy their first video camera for the summit. So people have been really willing to put themselves out there, and I appreciate the challenge of that. So thank you for rising to the occasion, because this topic is something that's personally really important to me. I mean, I came to the Feldenkrais method with a background in childhood trauma and abuse, and I feel like it was not the only thing, but it was a huge aspect, a ginormous aspect, in my ability to claim a life that I find very fulfilling and more than just worth living, which at a long time I certainly challenged whether it was even worth living, but I find very fulfilling. So I think it's a really important topic for us to address, and I'm thrilled to have you here with your particular background to help us try to understand it.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I just really appreciate you starting with such a personal share there, letting us know. And I also feel myself how much Feldenkrais has supported me emotionally in this work. Yeah. and
It's
just
really true,
really,
isn't it? It can really provide something. So let's get us started with understanding why Moshe Feldenkrais would have even come up with a work that had value, or did he think he had value for
oh,
people with trauma, or what was his thoughts?
right, right. When I started Feldenkrais training, I had significant chronic pain, and I had no idea what Moshe Feldenkrais was thinking, or who he was actually. And I really just entered the training, um, just to learn a little bit, to heal my own body. And in that process, really discovered how much came up for me emotionally. Saw people emotionally transform and get in touch with parts of themselves in the training, and started to feel a sense of safety and ease. And I think that's one of the real amazing things that was such a surprise to me, because I really just focused on pain. And so that really set me on this journey. I just say that because it set me on this journey of really trying to understand what it is that's happening with trauma, and being very committed to wanting to work with people with trauma. And I'm sure people have already talked about it on this cast, but Feldenkrais was really a pioneer, and he came from surviving the Holocaust, not being in it, but like all that transition of World War II, helping to found the State of Israel, and working with a generation of people who had a lot of trauma and physical pain. And so some of his books and writings are really trying to address that. And I think he looked at early psychology and found a different pathway. But just like how science works these days, where we can branch out in many different directions, this has certainly been a topic of interest for our whole society. And how do we address the impact of, and I'm going to go jump around a little bit. How do we address the impact of violence, abuse, shocks, things that are really devastating that can happen in our lives? And so nowadays, what's really exciting is that a lot of things are coming together. And I think Feldenkrais continues to play such an important role, but now we have ways of connecting it with what's also happening in the quote unquote, not exactly the mainstream, but the cutting edge of psychology.
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, we've seen with Porges's work, Stephen Porges's work, Basil
Mhm.
Vanderkort's, is it Basil? I don't know actually how his name is. So I
Yeah.
might as well ruin his name too. I've been ruining other people's names. Basil Vanderkork. Um, these individuals have, and many, many others, of course. Pat Ogden has
Yeah.
incredible work out there. These are people in the field of either neuroscience or psychology or psychiatry that have, through their own hard work, discovered, oh, the body has a lot to do with recovery. Now, Moshe, frankly, was, way before them, but he certainly wasn't able to hit the mainstream, and not even close to hitting the mainstream of the psychological movement. So it's good to see some kind of bridges being built between our philosophy, Moshe's philosophy, that the body, movement, awareness, all these things really matter in recovery
Mhm.
from trauma.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And it's not all coincidental. Pat Ogden, I don't want to get too off into these things, but she came out of Hakomi and Body Works as well. And Hakomi had an influence, borrowed many of Feldenkrais principles. These are just different, subsets of somatic therapies. I really have been thinking about what I want to talk about here. And I did a little survey. I don't know if you know, online.
Yeah, I saw that. That was very creative. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I got some questions here about people really wanting to understand how Feldenkrais works for trauma, and how can contribute and fit in. And so I was thinking that maybe that would be something I could talk about here today.
Yeah,
How does it sound?
let's dive into that.
Okay, great. So I just want to start, I'm going to just do a little bit of a spiel that I set up here, but trauma is like a word that we sort of use a lot in our culture, and it's become, it has a definition in the DSM, the psychology manual, but at the same time, it's also been researched and beyond that definition. I think one definition I really like is that it's defined as an overwhelming experience that goes beyond our ability to cope. And that definition really came from this woman, Judith Herman, who was looking at trauma in child abuse and in people who had PTSD. Veterans. And I really like this phrase. It says it overwhelms our ordinary human adaptations to life. And then people like Bessel van der Kolk have really started to study, actually along with Judith Herman, how it's not just affecting us in our thinking, but also in many systems of our body, our immune system, and our nervous system, which is really important for Feldenkrais, and our movement system. And all these systems work together to support us in having the stability of being who we are and being how we can act. And Feldenkrais is really, I think, particularly skilled at accessing the movement system, us through movement, right? We have this work called Awareness Through Movement. I think, actually, I was thinking about awareness through movement is one piece, really working through movement. And then the individual work, which we call functional integration, is also so important for trauma because it involves this sense of integration, right? Where trauma leads us to fall apart and to feel disassembled or disintegrated, not really together. Functional integration is about putting things together. I'm just going to pause there.
Well, Evelyn, I want to jump in there because I actually want to back up to the definition of trauma. I think that is a really important definition to just sit with for a moment, because it allows trauma to be trauma to an individual. That means what happens to you, it means the same, just quotes the same experience, and I'm going to put that in quotes, could happen to you and I. We could have been in the same room. It could have had the same thing happen to us at the same time. It doesn't mean that both of our systems were overwhelmed by it.
Mm-hmm.
And it also doesn't mean, I believe you would agree with this, that if my system is overwhelmed, it means I'm some kind of a weak person. It just means we're very unique individuals. And so when we think about trauma, and I think, and this is certainly true, there are really awful, truly horrendous things that happen to people. You mentioned the Holocaust earlier. This is a horrendous event. And but for some people, trauma can have been a bad experience in the classroom where there was a surprising, loud, unexpected event that was not necessarily traumatic to anyone else, or could be something from the dental office that happens to hundreds and thousands of people, but for some people it's traumatic. So I just kind of wanted to sit with that definition for a minute, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of complexity to how it's being defined. But yeah, there's this, the larger quote here says, traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection, and meaning. And I also want to elaborate that it was an interest of mine when I was in graduate school to look at trauma from a bigger perspective. And there have been cultural anthropologists who've studied, and there are responses that happen to people in overwhelming situations that occur in every culture. And they can look different. And they can look different, like you said, will look different for each of us. And also, how they're made sense of in those cultures is different.
And that really matters, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It matters, if you're freaking out and this is seen as a sign that you are speaking the social conscious of the culture, which is true in some countries, versus it's seen as you are crazy and you need to go, that is going to be a very different way that you get held and treated. And Feldenkrais also, I think we haven't really used that word trauma, and I think that's very important in our work to really think about. I think what we've used is this idea of learning and development and fulfilling our potential, but we do have this crossover with this idea of resiliency. Like, I think that you're speaking to how can we survive a threat?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe I'm not saying that right. Feldenkrais said that had two aspects, as you know, to his definition of health, and one of them was an ability to recover from a shock, because shocks are going to happen in life. And like he said, sometimes we can handle them and sometimes we can't. And then beyond recovering from a shock, he said, which we may get to in here, is this idea of living your unavowed dreams. So what does recovery look like? It means still being able to be in touch with ourselves, where we can listen and feel what's true for ourselves, which is so often what can be lost through overwhelming events.
Mm-hmm. Why don't you talk a little bit about the unique contribution then?
Yeah, sure. Let's see, I'm just looking at my note here so I can really get this. I think that first thing I want to say around that is that Feldenkrais uses movement and sensation as the access point. And this is part of a developmental process that we have throughout life. Like, starting from when we're children, we are learning how to develop more skills, from crawling on the floor to walking to standing. We really have a capacity to learn to be more resilient. And we do that through a very creative, exploratory, natural type of process, organic process of. And when there is extreme stress in life, that whole process gets halted. And there's a way that that feeling that you describe of having excess pressure and excess compensation happens, so that something that about being in the world that should feel, or could feel, I suppose, imaginally more natural or at ease, ends up feeling like you have to use so much effort to do it. And in Feldenkrais, we really start to open up that, or rebuild that capacity for learning, for feeling ourselves. And I could say, I guess I want to go in, and I sort of have these notes here, so I'm looking through it because I don't want to miss anything here. But we really have this ability to create a structure in which that can happen. And one of the things that's a very central principle in this work is to be able to move within that capacity of comfort and ease, right? So that we start to be able to listen to ourselves and start to begin to shift that focus internally and be able to feel ourselves in the here and now. And then a Feldenkrais lesson, or the way a practitioner works with a client, is not just, as you know, random, right? We make connections between different parts of ourselves in movement, between the shoulder and the hip, between our jaw and our belly. And when we make those connections, we support that feeling of integration, so that things feel like one whole versus a jumble of pieces and parts inside. Just checking in. How's this resonating for you?
Yeah. So that whole process of both either functional integration or awareness through movement, it's I mean, first, I think for myself or for people who I've worked with that have trauma, this idea that, you could start to really inhabit the present moment in your own body. I mean, whether it's called the present moment in your mind or not, in your own body, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Because when trauma or abuse is affected you in the way that you gave that important definition, that means that I believe it means, does it not, that necessarily I'm living a lot of my life in the past. I'm constantly referencing this other event. I'm split with this other event, events continues to siphon off my attention and my life force. And so I'm not really ever available to be present here now in my body. And truly experience myself. So I do think there's a brilliance in the Feldenkrais work for that. For me, it was certainly a surprise to find myself, really experiencing my body and finding what it was like to just be in the moment.
Yeah, totally. And, that process of tuning out is really where we don't have the sense of our own bodies. It can happen through stress. It can happen through just our work habits, our culture, which tells us to go, go, go and ignore our feelings. And particularly when there's a huge shock in the body, there's also the tendency to want to avoid those feelings and parts of ourselves. And so really, this process of, I totally agree with you. And I was thinking about that perspective, right? That when we're in that a trauma state can be thought of in Feldenkrais terms as like a habit, right? A way that we very much reference an automatic routine in order to do something. And we all need ways of being somewhat automatic, but at the same time, we need to be able to respond to what's here in the present moment. And so when somebody is going into a habitual state of anxiety or fear or even a memory flashback, they are really not able to stay with their present experience. And so through Feldenkrais lessons, there is so much more attention to the sensation and the here and now, and letting that become like a place that can carry us so that we don't get triggered so easily.
Yeah, and I think that's really key, that the statement that it's a habit, and that might not set well with some people, but I totally agree that beyond the event of the trauma, as years or weeks or months and years go on, it now becomes a habit. And it's the only thing you know. So you don't have it. It's not you have a choice. Habit, as according to Feldenkrais, is compulsion. So that doesn't mean people have a choice.
Yeah.
What Feldenkrais does, or did for me, and I've seen happen for, is that it began to give me a choice.
Yeah.
That was a surprise. Like that I had a choice was a surprise, right?
Can you give an example of that?
Well, you mentioned triggering. And I think for me, I began to learn that the principles in a Feldenkrais Awareness Through Movement lesson, where you begin to monitor your movement and you notice when things are coming up that feel like more tension or less tension, and you learn that gradation process. I was able to apply that gradation process to triggering. I was able to go, oh, that's how that works. Okay, here is me being triggered. Oh, too late, I'm triggered. Already done. Okay. So sorry, I got to spend a bunch of time getting out of that, right? But then I began to be able to back myself up, right? So that I could start to feel way back in the triggering process, way back, like, oh, there's where I'm starting to spin back into the habitual old thing. It was It might have been an hour before, it might have been 10 seconds before, but I could start to notice that. And then I could start to ask myself if that's really where I wanted to go.
That sounds
And
wonderful.
that I do feel came from the Feldenkrais work. Now, maybe it came from, the accumulation of everything that I did, because I did a boatload of stuff. And, and there's very few of them that I would put down that I would say I benefited from a lot of them. So, but that gradation process seems to be just so beautifully taught in the Feldenkrais work.
It really is. And yeah, definitely. And I think that's one area you're talking about where Feldenkrais can really benefit people, right? Where we learn through practice, through the practice of the lessons, through the practice of sessions, how to become more sensitive to ourselves and to be able to sense gradations, right? So that things aren't black and white, and be able to notice when you're not just actually getting to a place where you feel, and this is like literal, right? We feel resistance or tension in our body. We learn to listen to going back before that arises. But in the process, ending up feeling everything that's associated with that. Often the tension is arising, when we're pushing into tension, then we're pushing ourselves into that state and all the associated emotions and feelings that go with pressure or tension. And so really being able to pull yourself back and notice the step before and the step before and feel different ways of acting is so big in Feldenkrais. And it's not just like that practice, it's like the way it affects our whole nervous system and really starts, and it starts to allow us to make connections so that we can recenter ourselves and re-ground and have a feeling of what it's like to be in a place of more freedom.
So what do you think is happening in the nervous system? What do we think is happening in the nervous system in Feldenkrais when we do these lessons?
That's a good question. There's a lot of different metaphors where people are trying to make connections in the nervous system. In Feldenkrais, we talk about, I'm sure many people can talk about this here more than me even, but we just talk about that feeling of integration and regulation, like including the whole of ourselves. I'm just thinking of all these different metaphors. One might be that when we move, right, and we have mobility and connection through ourselves, we don't freeze certain parts of ourselves. We end up functioning better. We end up, some people say, toning the vagal nerve, right? The nerve that is being identified as one that really contributes to trauma responses. Another way we could look at it is that they say, and I always say they say because they look at it through brain imaging and who knows exactly what's the case, but they say that when we go into a real danger, we have an automatic movement response that comes from the amygdala, right? The part of our brain that goes into fear and automatic threat responses. And that when we learn through Feldenkrais, we actually retrain those fear responses. So that's another thing.
That's big. Yeah, right there. That seems really big.
Yeah. Thank you for slowing that down. I can definitely, yeah. These things become so familiar, right, to us.
For people who are listening that are, find themselves being scared a lot, that is a huge takeaway that could happen right there.
Right. And another, there's a lot of ways, is this nervous system or not, but we are always having associations, working together as a whole. And so when we go into certain stress responses or movement postures, maybe, like actors, right? They clench their hands or they do something to try to generate and emotional state in themselves. And we are, in a sense, generating them by things that we're doing without our awareness in our bodies. And when we start to shift some of the ways that we hold and carry ourselves, we have an ability to move ourselves into different emotional states through that connection that's already there between moving, as Feldenkrais would say, think, oh, I'm going to mess it up.
Feeling, acting. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. So the way that we sense and the way we move and how our emotions come out. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that this whole research on the way our sense of self develops. And there's a lot of focus on psychology about the relationship between the parent and the child and the movement and moving together and learning how to connect. And Feldenkrais, we really expand that because we're looking at our way of moving in the environment and gravity and how we, what am I trying to say here? How we develop. And so as we get more into, Feldenkrais used to say the body image is a self-image, right? That our sense of ourselves is very connected to our ways of being able to be in our body. And so, this security is really built in to the nervous system.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things, in order to be able to learn, I think most everybody agrees that in order to be able to learn, it has to be a certain level of safety.
Yes.
Every field agrees with that.
Right.
So for someone who's had a traumatic background, how can they feel safe going to an awareness through movement class or going to a functional integration session?
Right. Well, I think that people often know for themselves what they're willing to do. And of course, part of trauma is learning to listen to yourself more. And I've had people call me and say, oh, I'm not comfortable in a class. I would really prefer to work individually. And sometimes a class is easier because it's very anonymous. You don't have to socialize. Nowadays, you can do it in your living room with the internet if you prefer that. Although actually having just that very neutral social connection can be very supportive as well. And one of the nice, Feldenkrais has a lot of inherent safety built into it and a level that, therapy often can't get to because of the way that we really know how to listen to the sense of embodied safety through the limits and the touch. That said, I think it's always a relationship, and that's my bias, right? That we're always relating with another person, and can that person be connected with you in a way that feels safe and easy? And one way that Feldenkrais benefits is generally there's a moving away from the story, and so it provides a place where people are not going to get so into that side of things, pulled away. And then also,
Eveline, I think your mic, your arm is sometimes getting close to it or something, and we're getting a little squealing sound in the background.
Oh, is that what that is? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
So we were talking about this idea of moving away from the story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that is really key in the Feldenkrais work, and I think that could be problematic actually for some people, that we do encourage moving away from the story, that sometimes people aren't really ready to let go of that particular, I don't know if I want to call it a habit or not in this case, but aren't ready to move out of that phase, I would say.
Well, yeah, and I'm noticing, Cynthia, I'm actually appreciating that you're catching some of the terminology, because I am sharing a lot of the terms that Feldenkrais uses. And certainly we wouldn't want to just tell somebody that their trauma was a habit, right? Or we wouldn't want to say, oh, you just have a story about your experience. I think that can be very condemning for somebody, very judgmental. And certainly that's not a principle of Feldenkrais is to be non-judgmental. And I'm thinking of a range of where practitioners are at and how they might approach a client depending on what type of skill and capacity they have. And one thing that's really exciting in our community is that a lot of people who are interested in working with people with the emotions that arise have gone on to do something, right? To take some type of training in how to relate at some level therapeutically and supportively. And, you know, if you certainly don't want to look like you're dismissing anybody. And that's a real difference in what people are going to find safe. Like, you know, with trauma, like there's this work now on developmental trauma or complex trauma, and that's usually the idea that you have had trauma from your childhood, and that has affected your emotional sense of safety and security with people who are in a caregiving role. And often you can be sensitive to power dynamics or, you know, have a longing for care and support. And Feldenkrais can provide a lot of support for people in the right situations, right? Where someone can feel cared for without having to get too complicated with some, you know, in the way that a therapist would, who hopefully has the training and skill to navigate all that and provide that sort of like embodied sense of safety. And I think if somebody is a practitioner not really knowing how to navigate some of those waters, then we have the fallback of our work, but that we also can work complementarily with other practitioners.
I think that's a good point. I think that's a very good point that we could, you know, I mean, if I were going to have my cake and eat it too, I guess it would be that people would come to me because a psychotherapist was encouraging them to include, or they went to their psychotherapist and they said, I'd like to include these other ways of exploring, and their psychotherapist was really supportive. And that could happen maybe somewhere early in the recovery process or earlier than normally when people come to me, to be honest, is when they have already done psychotherapy for a very long time.
That's interesting. Yeah. I think that's very interesting to hear that, Cynthia. There's different paths I've seen, right? People have done it a long time, and some people who just blast through so many therapists and can't find any place. And then they find Feldenkrais is easier for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, that actually speaks to this idea that there's like no one size fits all, and that trauma is so unique. Just like trauma, again, is a metaphor that we are also unique. Mm-hmm. And what we're going to find safe has some general qualities, but is also unique.
Right. And I just want to go back to, because I do think that there are people who need, when you said trained to handle all that. As Feldenkrais practitioners, we're not psychotherapists, right. And we're not trained to handle transference, and which for some people is an important aspect of healing. At least in my opinion, it is. So. It is important, but we're not setting ourselves up as Feldenkrais, even though you are qualified as a therapist. I am not. So I'm not setting myself up to be in a therapy role, only that, at the same time, the Feldenkrais work has this ability for people to feel held.
Yeah.
And I think they're really being held mostly by themselves, but the container that the practitioner or the teacher provides, either in the class or in the private sessions, can be very beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's, you know, you're right that I have done a little bit of both. So, and sometimes I've, you know, gone from, you know, started with somebody with Feldenkrais and we ended up switching over and doing psychotherapy. And there's definitely a difference that happens, right, in that type of relationship. Maybe I won't go down that road there, but I really appreciate you mentioning transference, right? That can happen in life in general. It just means, just to define it a little bit, like the way our early desires for connection or our desires or our ways of feeling hurt with our caregivers can start to show up as if it was occurring all over again with somebody that is in some caring capacity. And I do find that it doesn't happen so extremely when you stay in the role of the Feldenkrais method. And but I wanted to come back, if it's okay. Is that okay to come back here? Just really thinking about safety, that one nice thing about Feldenkrais is that we have different ways to access people. So if somebody gets triggered lying down because that has been unsafe for them related to the type of trauma they experience, we can work in sitting. You know, I've had clients who say, I really can't have my feet touched. I don't know why. If, you know, or maybe they know exactly why, right? They'll tell you. And then we can access issues like we can access through the other parts of the body, right? Because there's a way that when we're talking about working with the way we're functioning, the way we're feeling, it's always going to be connected in Feldenkrais through all of us. And we have a lot of creativity as practitioners to do that. And that's actually part of why Feldenkrais can be supportive for trauma, is that we work with those parts of us that are stable and are resilient and are accessible, or we work in that small degree where we're resilient and accessible to build a connection to the parts of us that are less resilient.
That is just a beautiful statement, and the way that you stated it. So there was a word that you used earlier that we could go like away from the feet and we can access issues, but that's actually not exactly what we're doing. We're not really accessing issues. We're accessing the parts that work. That's when you went on to talk about these parts that work, and that is what we really are doing.
Yes.
We're accessing these parts that have a little more resiliency, have a little more connectivity, a little more conversation going on, and really allowing them to, those areas, to have a conversation with the areas that aren't feeling safe or accessible. It's a beautiful process that you've just described, and I think it's very, very important in distinguishing a difference between many approaches. In that, and this is true of whether you came in for an orthopedic problem or not,
right,
or a psychological issue, or you wanted to inhabit your body. It doesn't matter. Our approach is not to focus on the dysfunction.
Right. And, you know, I've heard this, there's this neuroscientist, Michael Merzenzik, who's presented a little bit on the connection of Feldenkrais and neuroplasticity. And I remember him talking about how when a person has a burn, this is the way I remember it, like there's a sort of a disorganization of the sensory nerves or whatever experience in the brain, but you can bring attention to the places that are not burnt, that do feel stable, and that can create order with the area that's burned. Now he's using this idea just in that sense of the brain order, right? Like just touch this place, whatever. But we're also creating stability through function, through the way that we a connection into a way of acting in the world. Because what really organizes us, in a sense, what keeps us together is this sense of self, this sense of our intention and what we're trying to do in our body. And so it's like that. And that's what's so interesting about Feldenkrais, is you're doing a lesson where you're just moving your arm or your leg or and it somehow connects to experiences you have of moving and being in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you described for me is it's just so practical. There's like, I mean, it's more than practical, but there's a huge practical underpinning to the work.
Mhm.
in this functional orientation that can turn around and go on and do things that we could call impractical. Like we could say that becoming a ballet dancer or doing, somersaults off of the ski jump or whatever, we could call that a much higher level expression of being human. It doesn't necessarily have a practical function in daily life. But because the work has got this ongoing thread of function in it, it's got such important take-home value right from the very first lesson. It's
Yeah.
not abstract, even if it seems abstract to people. It's not abstract.
Yeah, that's right. And even there, right, I think sometimes we use metaphors like that of ballet or, I actually got into skiing after I was in chronic pain injuries. We use these metaphors and experiences as this idea of increased skill in the body, increased physical skill. But when we're doing a Feldenkrais lesson and we're talking about trauma, we're also talking about really, I think, even much more emphasis on all the connection to feeling and the connection to one's sense of self that happens with it. So it's not just a ballet dancer. A ballet dancer can certainly drive themselves to the point of pain, but somebody who is really can feel that life and the pleasure of that movement. Maybe I say that because of my own background in the past, pushing myself through sports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, just we might have had different reasons why we didn't really notice pleasure as an option in our lives, but I mean, I remember the first movements that just felt luxurious, right? Like who knew that movements could feel absolutely luxurious?
I,
That can be something can be very elusive to people with a trauma background.
and I'm so glad that you are here talking with me, Cynthia, because I can really feel that pleasure as you talk about it. And I'm actually remembering we talked before, just that feeling. I think the image comes to mind. If it's okay, you said something about just stepping on your foot or something like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And for me, there was a moment, and I've talked about this on a video somewhere that's out there somewhere. But there was a time at going into the Feldenkrais training where I was still having regular post-traumatic stress nightmares,
Oh.
and I know, and I don't know the moment when these changed over, but somewhere in that year, 2 or 3, the nightmares changed to these dreams of beautiful, flowing, gorgeous movement. I mean, how cool is that? Anybody has post-traumatic nightmares knows how debilitating that is. Now, that is nothing. You can tell a person, stop having nightmares. You've got a habit in having nightmares. Come on, just stop it. But of course, that's never going to work, right? That's not what happened. Something happened deep inside of me that went, once my system realized pleasure was an option and that safety was an option and blah, 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 whatever it did back there in the background that I don't even know was happening, right? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, totally.
I just...
Yeah, totally. And that just, what, yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So I think you were going to maybe give us an experience of...
Can I say one thing right there?
Absolutely.
Well, I was just, what was I going to say? That, this piece about really building our inner life too and filling it with, such rich experiences. Oh gosh, did I just forget what I wanted to say there? I think that
if you haven't had enough other experiences,
I know what I wanted to say.
Okay.
So what I was going to say is that we are being driven by so much more than just thinking, right? And that's totally proven in psychology too, right? That there's so much more systems in the body and feelings and emotions. And so when we're moving, we're really tapping into a whole other level of experience. And it's not that you had to have the thought to yourself, like it's probably not just a mental thought that's translated. Moving in my body can be pleasurable. That might be the words that you use to make sense of that experience, but there's a real experience that you've had of moving in your body and it being pleasurable, and that shifting something inside.
Oh, absolutely. And there would be I would have been no way I could have talked myself into saying that, movement is pleasurable and therefore I now experience pleasure. It never worked. It is, and this is, as you know, a key aspect of the Feldenkrais work is that the lessons are constructed in a way that you don't know exactly where the lesson is leading, but then you discover something about how your arm connects to your shoulder. And just that alone can be like such a surprising moment. Oh my gosh, my arm connects to my shoulder connects to the other shoulder or the neck or the pelvis, or maybe it connects to the opposite foot. That those moments can be so surprising. And it's from those surprising discoveries that this other experience of pleasure or whatever that's in whatever words we put to it happens.
Well, I came from a background of being a gymnast, so I definitely had a lot of movement experiences. I had flipped around upside down as a kid, but I had chronic pain injuries, which I think is a form of trauma and certain emotional stress around all that stuff in life and other things. and just like really, but like but that idea of like something waking up inside and the pleasure that happens with that discovery. I mean, it comes back to this idea that we get pleasure through growing and we get pleasure through learning. And that when we have these areas where we feel halted inside, it may not have something like you can actually grab onto a lot of the times, right? Like, what is it exactly? But in a way, in a Feldenkrais lesson, we can, quote unquote, grab onto it. We can feel it. A practitioner can feel something with a client in their body, and you can be moving on the floor and feel where you have a new possibility open up. I'm going like this because I'm always thinking of those lessons where we move a leg gently from side to side.
Yeah, you're doing it right now in your own sensation. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really, and there's something physiological that happens there. I've certainly had that moment where things come together, where all of a sudden it feels like my blood flows through my hands and my body, and then I feel like a calm that takes over. And we hear clients talk about that all the time.
Absolutely.
That feeling of surprise at like, wow, I just feel more calm or more at ease.
Or some kind of space opening up, or I mean the descriptors go on and on and on, and they're quite profound for people.
Yeah, totally. So the thing that I was thinking about today is it's now sort of like a piece of something here. And when we're doing Feldenkrais, we're always thinking about the ways that different things can connect. And so this is just going to have you just take your finger. Actually, think of the mouth, right? Our mouth is really a place, we move our mouths very early in life. It's connected to a lot of different pulses inside of our body. So here you're going to just take your finger and you're just going to do very slow circles along. Let's just do the left side of your lip. So you're just going to go, switch around over and then move a little bit over to, there you go. Just do a small circle there. Do a circle there. Just take your time there. I'll do it with you, actually, even though we don't normally. And just I'm going to mention here that the circle, it's like you're just putting a very light pressure, that Cynthia knows how to do this, right? And just making a small circle, like those old mouse trackpad buttons. Um, and then coming along the corner to the other side and just along the lower side. We're just going to do the left side there. You know, I just jumped right in here and I'm realizing I got so excited to start. And now, normally we do a little scan here in Feldenkrais first, but take a moment now and just pause, Cynthia, and whoever's out there, and just feel right now yourself sitting on the chair. If you're sitting, and you could do this lying down, but it's okay if you're not. And you're going to just feel the inside of your mouth on the left side and on the right side. And I apologize to the audience out there for not tuning into that first, but now just sense a sense of space inside your mouth, where your tongue rests, the space in your cheek and your lips. And now you're going to just take your tongue and just, this is a little bit of a made up piece here. So you're going to just take your tongue and you're just going to touch the inside of your lip on the top lip. So the opposite of where you were just touching, maybe more on your lip there. And just give a little poke. And, you know, like, we're always moving with ease in Feldenkrais, so be aware that you can keep your tongue as relaxed and as at ease as possible. And certainly if you feel like this is hard or you have some jaw challenges, then, you know, just go very, very small and you can just go in that general direction. And there's other works that work somatically, you know, that will work with the sense of the tongue. But here we're just tracing the lip a little bit here. And then I'm going to have you take your hand and just maybe put it on the left side there and just feel your tongue a little bit as you're moving. So you can, from the bottom, like you'll feel some muscles there, and just let that soften a little. And then let yourself take a little bit of a rest. And again, just noticing what it's like inside your mouth on the left side and on the right side there. And I'm just going to add a few other elements here, you know, for people who, we're all going to be a little bit different. What's comfortable, what's safe. But just notice what it feels like in your jaw and your neck, what your breath is feeling like right now, especially since you've done that one side and not the other. Just noticing how it is on the left side and the right side. And now you're going to just do a movement of closing your left hand a little bit. That same left hand you were just moving your lip with, you're just going to close it slightly. So if you go fast, of course we can close our hand, but go very small, just like as if your hand was just floating closed. So that way you don't go so far past where there's a feeling of resistance. You might not even close your hand all the way. And then you're just going to do a little bit of a movement of reaching that tongue forwards and to the left as you close your hand. Well, maybe let's do it the opposite. Reach your tongue. And then bring your tongue, try it the other way. Now reach your tongue out and bring it back as you close your hand over to the left. There you go. And then just take a rest again. And now you're going to look down with your left eye as you close your left hand. Look down towards your mouth. And then just look up a little bit and then look down as you close your hand. Well, just look forwards. You don't have to look up. Just look down as you close your hand and then let it come up. You can let your head nod a little bit down a little. Just a small amount. And this whole time you're paying attention that you are breathing and able to do this in just a way that's comfortable with yourself. And maybe close your hand now and look down and also roll backwards in your chair so that you start to scrunch down a little bit smaller, just like a tiny bit smaller. And then you come up as you open your hand. And then just let that go again. And then just take a moment and sense the way your left arm feels right now compared to your right arm. The way the sides of your face feel and the insides of your mouth on the two sides. Notice your breath on your two sides and in your belly, and how your legs feel right now. And I think that's just a really little example here of just connecting through some of the, actually, let me take a moment here. Cynthia, since you're my person here doing this with me, how was that for you?
It was lovely, and I feel like in what I was sensing with my eyes closed, it's like my lip on the left side, the lips are big, these are small, my face is big, this is small, everything over here is big, everything over here is all small.
Your face is actually looking different. It was on the camera as you were doing the lesson.
Mm-hmm. Feels different. Yeah, so nice little lesson, nice little experience.
Yeah, and you know, this is just an idea of following those patterns of closing and opening, and there's a lot of different components that we can draw on in Feldenkrais when we think about how we use our mouth and we use our hands, how we've used them early in life, developmentally, but also what that connects to in our nervous system.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Eveline, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. We are asking people if since the map is the territory, is our theme, how would you like to expand your own personal map or the map of our field or your work at this point?
You're going to have to rephrase that question for me a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody's working a map. So how would you like your map or the map of Feldenkrais or the map of your field to change? It can be any of those ranges.
That's a great question. You know, I'm really happy that you invited me to do this. I have been doing more and more therapy in my practice, and Feldenkrais is a piece of that. And then I also see clients with Feldenkrais and trauma histories. And so it's been really nice to think about how to articulate this and develop things more. And I would love for people to really recognize the value of Feldenkrais in personal growth beyond. I think we've been known as a practice a lot for pain relief or for sports or areas like that. And yeah, and definitely be out there contributing to making that known and understood. And so this is definitely challenging me to grow in that way.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, as everybody can tell, this is a topic that, again, as I said before, is really near and dear to my heart. And I do hope that more people seek out the Feldenkrais work as part of their recovery, and then moving beyond recovery into actually living their life and doing what they want to do when they're no longer so trapped by either chronic pain or chronic emotional pain. So sometimes we pull those things together as if they're two separate things. I'm not convinced that they are. And so I hope that this talk will be another drop in the bucket of letting people know that Feldenkrais is of value, and that like finding any kind of practitioner, you call them up, you ask them some questions, and if it doesn't feel like it's a great fit for you, go to somebody else. You're not married to taking the first person you talk to, and even if you need to do something with somebody online, I think it can work very well. It may not be ideal over the long run, but there isn't a Feldenkrais practitioner in every town, and you can do quite a lot online.
Well, yeah. I hope I'm just jumping in here to say, yeah, I think it's so important to find somebody that you feel comfortable working with. And yeah, oh, and Cynthia, I do want to say one other thing here. Through doing this process, am getting very interested in reaching out more to psychotherapists and helping them understand this work more. And I found that there's a very unique set of questions out there too. And we're all on a journey and really are just all seeking.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's lots for all of us to learn. There's all kinds of ways each of us can expand our maps ongoingly. So I just going to wrap us up here. We're going to be ending this and literally starting the panel discussion with Donna Ray and Ellen Quistel for the 3 talks in the nervous system health track. So I hope that you'll get up, be able to go get something to eat, drink, and take a little walking break and make yourself more comfortable even for the panel discussion, and come back and join us for that. Eveline, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia. Yeah. This is really fun.
Good. I appreciate it very much. So we're just going to say goodbye and see you in a few minutes.
Okay. Sounds good.